Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here for another Wednesday debate. And this week we are going to be debating whether or not we all live in a matrix-like simulation. Is this real? Is it not real? Are we dreaming? We're going to find out today. We have John Buck and Alan Washburn here. John Buck is going to be taking the affirmative that, yes, we in fact are dreaming at this very moment. None of this is real. And Alan is going to fight back with the probably less likely premise that we are living at base level reality. So I will turn it over to John. I will give him the floor. He's going to make his opening argument. And then, as normal, we're going to turn it over to Alan to do his best to steel man that argument and then rebut it. So go ahead, John. You have the floor.
All right, awesome. Thanks. All right, let me share my screen. In the screen?
It is. We're good to go.
All right. First, I'd like to just give my thanks for both of you for doing this, as well as Pleasure of Doubt and Concept Tut on Twitter for helping me refine my presentation. I'm excited to discuss this quite interesting topic with everyone, and hopefully you all get something out of this conversation here. Now, I just want to point out up front that I'm not an expert. I'm only a layperson that is building up my case from the materials that actual professionals have already put out there. And I've given Adam a link to a page with all my sources that will, I guess, be put down below afterwards for anyone that would like to get a better grasp of my arguments. Also, I want to clarify that I'm not going to be making the strong, definitive case that we absolutely, most certainly are inside of a simulation. Only that I think it's both not just possible, but even quite plausible that we are. And that a person is rationally justified in taking the hypothesis quite seriously. Now, regarding the question, are we living in a simulation? I believe it can be taken in two ways. One, where we are the simulated beings within a computer or server of some kind, similar to how the AIs generated inside the Tron world in the movie, or that we are external players of some sort connected to the simulation, similar to how the brains are digitally connected in the movie The Matrix. Now, answering which one of these exact scenarios being correct is actually unnecessary for my purposes in simply taking the affirmative position that we are living in a simulation. Now, I'm going to be arguing on both the basis of plausibility as well as the basis of evidence. Here's a rendition of Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis that if it's possible to create simulations that could pass for reality for the conscious beings within it, then it is likely any society with that ability would do so. Not only that, but that they would likely create many such simulations. Given that there would be many more simulated realities than the original, any given conscious being is more likely to be inside of a simulated world rather than the original. That is my argument from plausibility, that we would most likely be living within a simulation if the two propositions are possible. In order to refute it, my opponent will either need to argue that it is impossible for a civilization to create such simulations, or that even with said capacity, such a civilization would not bother creating them. Otherwise, it would be the more rational position to assume that we ourselves are in one of the many simulated worlds rather than the original. Now, the plausibility argument is very much theoretical and can't really tell us with any form of certainty if we are in fact within a simulation. However, if the simulation hypothesis is true, then there are certain ways in which the world would differ from what we'd expect given a common sense realist model for reality. And so we can make predictions based off what we already know about our own simulated worlds that we create, like Minecraft or something like that, for what we should expect if the simulation hypothesis is true. And so the hypothesis can be strengthened or weakened depending on the results to these predictions. Now, what might those be? If our world is a simulation, then it would mean that what we assume to be matter and physical 3D objects would actually only be symbolic representations of underlying information, nothing more than that. So if I'm in Minecraft, what I see as a 1 by 1 by 1 meter cube is not actually that in reality. Rather, it's simply an interface icon that allows me, from my vantage point from inside the game, to use that icon to interact with the underlying code that's being run from the computer. Another prediction that we can make in order to save computing power, particular properties to objects will only need to be loaded upon interaction by the participants of the simulation. For instance, a game like Tetris doesn't really require the entire predetermination, every single block pattern that you're going to encounter. It only needs to load the next upcoming one as soon as you lock your selection into the place for the one that you're working on right now. Also, to save up computing power, you'd only require loading the particular historical pathways to knowledge. No, you'd only require loading the particular historical pathways to objects upon inspection by the participants, and only if they actually have access to that knowledge. A video game analogy I could use is the Nemesis feature in the Lord of the Rings game Shadow of Mordor, where when you defeat an orc leader, it tells you which of the other orc leaders out there that have moved up in ranks. Theoretically, it's telling us the causal chain of history that led to that one orc defeating the other. But we really know for ourselves that this game is only generating that story when we actually perform certain actions within the game. All right, so we have our predictions for simulationism. Now, do we have evidence that would support them? I believe that there are at least 3 pieces of independent evidence which, if true, greater support the simulation hypothesis over that of our common sense realism. I'm going to explain each of these in further detail in just a moment, but here's the breakdown of the evidence. Holographic principles suggest that the entirety of information for 3D objects must be fully writable onto a 2D surface without there being any loss, meaning that our reality is information written onto a 2D surface, and our perceptions of 3D objects are illusory. Bell's theorem applied to quantum entanglement suggests that one or more of our core assumptions regarding reality must be false. And the necessary conclusions that would be able to fit the data would actually greater match our predictions for the simulation hypothesis than realism. And like I said, I'll get into this in just a second. The retrocausality implied by the quantum eraser experiment suggests that our having knowledge of a particle's pathway changes its history. Now, as our meaning that reality changes when and if we look at it. The past events to the world do not codify until they are interacted with by us. Now, as our model of common sense realism does not quite account for this data, which I'll get into even further in just a second, do we have a model that can actually coherently support each of these points? I believe that the simulation hypothesis does manage to do so adequately. Each of these 3 I could probably use individually to support my case, so I want to elaborate upon each. If you have any further questions regarding them, then we can go even deeper into them during the question and answer period. All right, here's the very basic breakdown of the holographic principle as laid out by the physicist Leonard Susskind. Black holes emit radiation and dissipate over time. Objects that fall in cannot escape a black hole. The information of an object is indestructible. As well, the entirety of information from an object that falls into a black hole cannot fit within the volume of it, only on its surface area. Meaning that in order to retain the information of an object without loss and without it being extinguished through time, it would have to be written onto the outer surface of the black hole in Planck units as 2D bits of information. Meaning, as strange as it might sound, that there can be nothing more to our world of 3D experience than just 2D information appearing to us as 3D, like a hologram. Since if there was something extra to it being a 3D object, this information would be erased, which physics says is impossible. It would be erased when it falls into the black hole. Why is this important? Because it matches our simulationist predictions that what we perceive to be 3-dimensional matter is actually only 2D information that's being displayed to us as otherwise. This also counters expectations we normally have under common sense realism, that information is constrained within 3-dimensional matter and cannot be otherwise. All right, and now on to my next piece of evidence. Hopefully you all have at least heard of the term quantum entanglement. It's basically that entangled particles that are separated will still share opposite properties to each other, even across great distances. But there's more to it than just that. So measuring an entangled particle along an alignment causes its entangled twin to immediately oppositely shift to that realignment. If we interact with one, it causes the other to change, something Einstein critically called spooky action at a distance. Now, in order to explain the data, one of these must be true. Information is traveling faster than the speed of light in order to tell the entangled pair to change what it will do now that its twin has been measured, which would violate our theory of relativity, something essentially necessary for our modern physics. The information travels backwards in time to the entangled particle, retaining relativity, sort of, but violating our notion of causality, a prevalent assumption under realism, but not really required under simulationism, for the server could just simply trace back a few steps or maybe simply limit access to certain memories for the participants of the simulation. Certain informational properties to a particle are not actually intrinsic to them, and or they are only created upon measurement by us, which would violate our notion of realism. Whereas under simulationism, the properties are either assigned when necessary, or they exist on the hardware itself, by which our icons of particles are simply reading information from off of that. Or finally, it could be the case that the particle and its entangled pair are two parts of the same object, where you cannot influence one without affecting the other, which then violates our notions of locality and the restrictions of space. Under realism, you'd have to admit that spatial separations aren't actually boundary conditions, and some underlying reality is what our world is supported by, or being simulated on. Whichever of these violations you might consider most plausible, it would still better fit within the hypothesis that our world is a simulation over that our world is self-subsisting. All right, and finally, I'll explain the last experiment quickly, but it requires a bit of priming knowledge. You're familiar with a double slit experiment, right? If you have two slits and fire just a single photon packet at them, you'll get an interference pattern on the screen behind it, almost as if light exists as a probability wave that passes through both slits and ripples against itself onto the other side. But if you measure one of the slits, you see whether or not the photon itself passed through. You affect the probability wave, so it's no longer interfering with itself, and you would now get two vertical lines on the screen. That's if you're measuring it. Now, the physicist John Archibald Wheeler actually came up with a thought experiment for another type of double slit experiment, this one on a cosmic scale. If the light from a quasar thousands of light years away came across a galaxy in between us and the quasar, and it had to bend around one side of it or the other before reaching to us, then the light would follow the same habit of taking both pathways and interfering with itself on the other side, creating another striped interface pattern for our measurements of the light here on Earth. However, if instead of just using screen, like with the double slit experiment, we used directional measurement devices where we could point them at one side of the galaxy or the other so that we could measure the light for how we measure the light, this actually changes whether or not the light went around both sides of the galaxy or just one. So making our measurements in the present actually affects the pathways of photons thousands of years ago in our past. Now, it certainly appears like retrocausality is taking place, but this is only if we're assuming that the pathway of the photon happens before we measure it. If we instead assume that it's like the backlogs of history generated for the Shadow of Mordor nemesis, the pathway of the particle only needs to be defined if we have a way of accessing the exact direction the photon packet took. Now, that's all just a thought experiment, so we'd be wise to take it with a grain of salt. Except they've actually created laboratory tests based off of the same principles of John Wheeler and found that it really is the knowledge that we scientists gain after the photon has already hit our measurement devices that affects whether or not the light behaves as a wave or as a particle, passing through a double slit or both. It's too complicated to get into fully right now, but I'd highly recommend the video from PBS Spacetime in my notes for a full rundown of it. Or I can explain the details during our question and answer period later on. If we're trying to interpret the data using a realist assumption that the particle must follow a specific pathway independent to how we might measure it at the very end of the timeline of the causal chain of events, realism would suggest that some sort of weird retrocausality is occurring when we make the measurement at the end of the chain. But by using the simulation hypothesis as our interpretive model, we can explain our observations in a much simpler and intuitive way, that the past history to a photon is only loaded as a way to make sense of what we see in the present. The delayed choice quantum eraser experiment tells us that the exact history of the particle passing between slit A, B, or both depends on whether we as users have access to knowing that pathway, similar to how in the video game Watch Dogs, where focusing on a character will tell you their prior internet history. But if you don't bother looking at that character, no such history needs to be probabilistically generated, even though your character is still, or that character is still in the world, just in a much simpler form. All right. In conclusion, we have reason to believe that if the production of simulations are possible, we'd be more likely to be within one of them rather than the original reality. We have reason to believe that our entire reality is akin to a hologram written onto a 2D surface, which is a better evidence for simulationism than realism. We also have reason to believe that certain objects in our reality do not actually hold a definite property until they are measured by us, which is also better evidence for a simulation. And we have reason to believe that the knowledge we observers have of objects affects their behavior in the past, prior to our even having had said knowledge, which is a greater evidence for the simulation as well. So, are we living in a simulation? I think with that, we have good reason to seriously consider that, yes, we very well might be. Thank you for your time.
All right. That was a great introduction.
Well, John Buck has already defeated me in terms of presentation, because I don't have a PowerPoint. So I think before I go ahead and try and steelman the argument, and it's interesting, what I'd like to do is I'd like to give from the wiki the 3 propositions that make up the simulation argument, because I don't, those weren't addressed earlier, so that we can start from there, and I'll try and steelman the argument a little bit. Does that work?
Yeah, go ahead. Perfect.
Okay. So from the Wikipedia page, basically the 3 propositions are: the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that is one that is capable of high-fidelity ancestor simulations, are very close to 0, or the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to 0, or the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1, i.e., you're living in a simulation hypothesis, or you're living in a simulation, and that's the hypothesis for that. So, trying to steelman the argument, I'm not sure I quite followed the fact that we're 2D versus 3D portion. I definitely think I picked up on the part where essentially the argument sounded to me like, because of some artifacts of the way that particles move, and essentially it, I don't know, I'm having a little bit of trouble with steelmanning the argument. I do think that some of my initial statement does address some of my objections to the statements that were made, but I don't know, maybe you can help me out, John, a little bit.
Alan, do you want him to try to simplify the argument? I think you're getting caught up on some of the evidence that he laid out. Do you mind?
You're probably right.
Do you mind just laying out your argument without the evidence, John, and maybe he can go from there?
Sure. So without going through the exact elements to the evidence, I would say that if the simulation hypothesis is true, there would be certain predictions that we would make based on our knowledge of what simulated worlds are like in our own reality. So like Minecraft would be a simulated world. GTA 5 is a simulated world. Using what we know about simulations, we can make predictions about how our universe would behave if the simulation hypothesis was true. And so if we can make predictions about...
Let me stop you there. So would you say that this is it? That essentially you feel as though there are glitches in the matrix, and that you have identified those glitches within the matrix? Is that essentially what you're...
No, not really. Okay. I'm using it like a scientific model. So if you have a scientific model for the solar system, like say you have the Ptolemaic model where the Earth is the center of the solar system, you can make predictions based off of that model. And then if the predictions fail, then it lends, it sort of weakens your case for that model itself. And so I'm saying that there's 2 different models that you can have. You can have the like common sense realist notion of reality. Like this is the only reality that's out there really, or this reality isn't reliant upon some like meta reality that underneath it, something like that. So and there are certain predictions that we can make using that. Like one of them would be that matter itself is kind of like fundamental. Like you can't like matter can't be described entirely from information. Like that would be like one basis for a prediction that you might make under the common sense realist model. So I'm saying that there's like 3 main things that if our world was a simulation, you could predict this is what we would find. One, that matter is illusory and is simply referencing information. Two is particular properties to objects are randomly generated upon our interaction with them. It's not like the particles themselves already had
are all there all the time. Yeah, it's only.
Well, no, it's not just that. It's like, okay, so the direct example that I used was the quantum entanglement and Bell's the violation of Bell's inequalities, where a electron has like a spin up or a spin down, but the only way that we can tell if it's spin up or spin down is when we actually measure it. Now, the weird thing is when you have these quantumly entangled electrons, like a positron and an electron, and then we measure this electron according to a specific orientation of our measuring device, the other electron will reorient itself according to that new alignment that we just used on the first one.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. And so the reason that would be evidence more for simulationism rather than common sense realism is that one assumption or prediction that we would make under common sense realism is that the particle itself already had that spin like aspect to it before we even measured it, and by us measuring it, it wouldn't affect this other particle. But using the prediction from simulationism, I would predict that measuring this specific thing, it will randomly generate a spin up or a spin down. Like like you as a simulate, if I'm running a simulation, then I don't need to measure whether it's spin up or spin down until I don't need to have that property to the particle unless people are actually measuring it and able to find out what its spin is.
So do you think you can steel man it now, Alan?
Okay, so in the simplified form, there's three bases. Okay, between these two models of reality, common sense realism and simulation hypothesis, there are three pieces of evidence that we would predict. And for the simulation hypothesis, and when we look at the data, the observations from the different experiments that I discussed, they better support the predictions rather than the predictions we might make under a common sense realist model.
Gotcha. Okay, so you're suggesting that there are experiments that we can do within a simulation that themselves would not be simulated, but provide evidence that we are in a simulation, and that they do.
I mean, yeah, I can see kind of what you're saying, that like, how do we know if we're in a simulation? How can we trust the reliability of our experiments that we put forward? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think that's like when you went over that portion of it, it made me think that, wait a minute, are you arguing against the simulation? Because the common argument I was seeing was anything you could test that would say we are not in a simulation would be because it was simulated data, right? So, but I feel like you're trying to use that to say that means we are in a simulation.
No, I actually disagree with Nick Bostrom on that case. I think there are actual predictions that you can make regarding common sense realism that can be falsified, and like one such like in fact, it's even laid out in the argument itself. Like, if it's impossible to create simulated worlds, then Bostrom's argument completely falls flat. Like, if from everything that we know, it's completely impossible, then it at least gives us good reason to not take his argument seriously. But I'm saying, so like, there's predictions that we can make using common sense realism that will either will be verified through our experiments, things like that, as well as for simulationism. Now, of course, you can raise the objection that if we're in a simulation, how can we trust that our experiments are actually telling us reality? I don't think that really makes a difference, because even if like we're being tricked by the simulation, I mean, it would still be better evidence for there being a simulation, and it would just mean that whoever programmed the simulation gave us a way in which we could think that we were inside of a simulation.
Okay.
Alan, can you steel man the argument? I'm familiar with two arguments in favor of simulation theory, and he's only making one. Like, there's another one. that
Sure.
Bostrom makes,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure why he's not making it. But Alan, let's stick to one argument. Can you give us a steel man of this argument?
So I think I'm getting closer, and basically it's around the fact that there are experiments that we can run within the simulation that are counterintuitive. Therefore, they would lend us to think that we are in a simulation. Is that close? Am I getting
close?
close?
Yeah, they would be counterintuitive according to a certain model that we have in mind. If
Okay.
like, that's the thing. There's certain other models in which it wouldn't be counterintuitive. Like if you're raised in like Hinduistic Brahmanism or something like that, where you already had this kind of idea that the world is all an illusion, then this would be something that would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, perfect sense.
That's awesome.
Right. Okay. Well, so I do have a prepared statement. Maybe if I just go over that, I think that addresses some of the things that you had in your, certainly not all of the points that you had in your slides. And then we can go from there. Does that work for you, Adam?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
So
I think we're all on the same page here. Just for the audience, do you mind if I attempt to steel man?
Please. Yes.
So I'm thinking you're basically saying that if we live in a simulation, the world will have certain properties, and we can see those properties when we do these various experiments. One of the properties I'll just go over that you pointed out was this idea, and we see this in video games all the time. The world is generated when we look in that direction. The world isn't generated when you're looking in the opposite direction. There is no world behind you. It's basically generated on the fly. And there are these I think you pointed out the double slit experiment, where that is a example of at the quantum level where particles are literally changing their position, their states of being as we look at them. So that would be the argument.
Right. And the particular thing about like for the double slit experiment, I mean, the photon itself has this like probability wave in which it's going to be one of something, but the only time that it actually changes from just being a kind of like multiple probabilities where it's going through both slits at the same time, the only time that it actually becomes an actual like photon is when it like either is measured by us through some sort of like polarizing screen, or it actually hits up against some like piece of film or something like that.
Right.
So it would still be similar to simulationism, where like, okay, I have a random number generator, and then when somebody interacts with this object, I'm going to run the random number generator, and then it's going to give a result, a probability result based off of that.
Right. Just like video games. So, okay.
Exactly.
Alan, your statement and counter argument?
Sure. All right. So I also want to thank you guys. Adam, I know that like I don't have a YouTube channel, so you took a little bit of a risk by having this guy who's never done a debate before give it,
I like risk. I'm a risk taker.
but anyway, so I really wanted to thank you for taking a chance. I do appreciate it. So I'll start with my statement. Basically, researching this debate, I found it frustrating because I saw a lot of people conflate their points about matrix-like simulations and ancestral simulations all the time, but they're not the same. They are different. So the most important thing to realize when discussing a matrix-like simulation is that it's a discussion about the nature of reality itself. Is this real? Is that real? Can a digital apple actually feed a person? It's philosophical in nature. That's not the discussion I'm here to have. The title of the debate video is for clicks only. Make no mistake, we're discussing the simulation argument and the simulation hypothesis, which is mathematical. The foundation for the simulation hypothesis is based on probabilities, not perceptions. And that's what I intend to discuss. The two types of simulations are not interchangeable. Elon Musk is convinced that we are living in a simulation, and he uses this anecdote about 40 years ago we had Pong, and now we have near photorealistic games. Think about where we'll be in another 40 years. Make no mistake, that is a non sequitur. This discussion is not about fooling people into believing that we're in a simulation. Doing so makes one convenient assumption that we don't get to make when having this debate, and that assumption is that we're dealing with an existing consciousness, our consciousness. We're not. When you're talking about the simulation argument, you can throw that out the window. We're talking about creating consciousness. Creating sentient beings, and not just one, but billions, all at the same time, that's not a small feat. It also means that we are not living in base reality. We are 100% a construct within a computer, and our consciousness has been created by that computer. Any discussion outside of that lens is a different discussion. So at this point, I'd like to add a fourth proposition to the simulation argument that I put forth earlier, that I feel that Bostrom kind of missed. It was alluded to maybe in proposition 1, and John absolutely touched on it, and that is, it is not actually possible to create a full world ancestral simulation. So why not, you might think? Well, first, the previously mentioned consciousness problem. Being certain that we can create consciousness is treated as a mere assumption in a lot of videos, but that's a huge damn assumption I don't think we get to make. But there are other problems as well. I've seen write-ups on creating simulations that get around some of the big data problems, like how many atoms comprise everything, by saying that doesn't matter. You don't need to see what's inside the table until it's broken apart and examined. And that's true. But it's also true that through a thorough examination of the table, that needs to provide accurate results, meaning anything the billions of conscious agents want to do to try and break their simulation, or at least learn more about the world they're in, those need to provide the correct outputs. Experts agree that general relativity and quantum field theory don't play well together. How are we supposed to write an accurate simulation when there is so much about our existence that just doesn't add up, that we don't understand? And simply increasing computational power does not address that, nor does it account for any possible hard limits we might have with our knowledge or our ability to understand things. Physicists believe that there are at least 10 dimensions of space and 1 of time. How are we supposed to figure out what those dimensions are without being able to perceive them? Currently, we can't test these dimensions, but what if in the future we can? Making a simulation, we need these answers. We can't just guess. What we're doing as a species is we're trying to figure out the rules to chess without having a rule book, but at a much grander scale, and we can't even perceive most of the game. So the bottom line is that any test a conscious being in a simulation wants to run needs to produce consistent and correct responses, and those need to be coded by the simulation, by the creator of that simulation. But it's no fun to just stop there and say, we can't do it, let's end the conversation. Let's imagine that you do get there, that you actually do figure out what you need to know, like everything there is to know about the universe. How would you ever know that you did, that you were done, that there was nothing more to learn? Today, things that are considered settled science are doubted by the fringes. Earnest flat earthers do exist. For things more theoretical, there will always be significant dissent. But let's take it even one step further. Let's say you did do it. You knew it. You really knew you had figured out everything. You unlocked the key to the universe. Well, why would you need to simulate it? What if in order to make a truly grand simulation, an ancestral simulation, you need to discover all the secrets of the universe, but once you did, you no longer needed to actually simulate it. You had the answers. When Bostrom himself was on Rogan, he said, it can be hard to know how hard a problem is to solve until you've actually solved it. And that is so true. I think a lot of people are trying to solve the wrong problem when it comes to the simulation hypothesis. Bringing it back to Musk, it's not about making the game look better. It's about making it a lot more accurate, the underlying substrate, not the glitzy front end, and therein lies the problem. Some people just assume we can solve it, but what if we can't? I believe it was Paul Boghossian who said, when you're having a discussion with someone of a different ideology, it's helpful to ask them what evidence would change their mind. I suspect for a lot of people in my vote regarding the simulation argument, they might answer, well, creating an actual simulation. I mean, that makes sense, right? Ironically, for me, that would actually have the opposite effect. I'll say that again because it's really important. I believe being able to create a simulation as described by Bostrom means we are in base reality and we do not live in a simulation. I know it's counterintuitive, so stick with me and I'll explain. Imagine that you're able to create a simulation. That simulation and any sub-simulation will be run on a base computer in base reality, and this creates 2 major problems at least. Problem number 1 is a memory capacity problem. PSA Sitch alluded to this on a stream a few months ago when this subject came up. But if you successfully create an ancestor simulation, eventually that simulation will create an ancestor sub-simulation, who in turn will create another simulation, and another one, until we reach a near subset of sub-simulations. In fact, the probabilities of the simulation argument kind of rely on it. But here's the catch. Doing so would eventually create a nesting doll situation where the inner dolls would become larger than the outer dolls, causing the entire system to cascade and crash into failure. Ultimately, every 1 and 0 in the sub-simulation would need to be represented in some way in the base computer because near infinity is really big. So to combat this problem, the base simulation likely needs to do one of two things: either proactively end a simulation before that simulation can create an appropriate sub-simulation, or somehow prevent the simulation from being able to do that in the first place. But there's a second problem, and this one's actually worse. Post-humans would likely want to speed up the simulation as much as possible. They will want to run millions of years of simulated reality in seconds. But they'll also need the computers created within that simulation by the sentient beings to perform as realistically as possible. This dichotomy of competing priorities cannot be reconciled, and the problem would compound very quickly with each additional sub-simulation. So to illustrate this simply, let's start real easy. Imagine that you're in a simulation that runs just twice as fast as base reality. So a 24-hour day completes in 12 hours in the simulation. This means that regardless of how fast the computer running the simulation is, there will be a speed limit for the computers within the simulation. Even though those computers are technically running at the same speed as the base simulation, because of the time contraction, they would be perceived and measured as running at best half the speed of the base computer. So for early computing, that's not going to matter. But as the simulation reaches technical synergy with base reality, it's definitely going to matter. Also, would this even be a valid simulation? Think about each sub-simulation. The problem gets exponentially worse. So because of these two problems, I've created my own two propositions. I call one the nesting doll paradox and the other one the speed limit dichotomy. What I think is great about them is if we wanted to settle whether or not we're in a simulation, we should work as hard as we can towards achieving them. And then that will likely prove we're not already in one. So are these propositions insurmountable? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe I'm just dumb and there are obvious solves. I'd love to hear about them, but they're just two problems I came up with thinking about it for a short time. How many problems are waiting behind them? How do you know that there isn't one that is impossible to overcome? Just hand waving the difficulty of creating an ancestral simulation really bothers me. So that was the end of my statement. I think the things that I can pull out of it that make me not like wonder or question what John put forward was basically around, essentially, I think that from our perspective, it's what John's describing in these tests just shows that we don't know the universe well enough, period. So I guess that's where I'll end it.
So, John, do you want to steelman his counter argument? It sounds like he's going at the second argument that you didn't really make, but we alluded to.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a couple good points that he makes up. So one of them, it seems like, as you just mentioned at the very end there, is that there's so much of the universe that we don't understand that it really weakens our ability to think anything with certainty regarding things outside of our domain of understanding. Is it something kind of like that?
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it. I mean, I did write up, I had to cut it for time. I did write up a summary. So I mean, I could read that real quick for you guys if you think that there's value in it. If not, that's fine too.
Sure. If you want to go, you can go right ahead.
Sure. All right. So my summary was this. Basically, my number one assertion is that the arguments that focus on fooling conscious minds is different and not pertinent to the discussion. It's not the challenge that needs to be solved. Distinctions need to be made between simulations that create consciousness and ones that leverage existing consciousness. And I think we're on the same page about that. It's not about fooling inhabitants of the simulation. It's about constructing a simulation that's accurate enough to pass, right? And then Bostrom's propositions are based on probability. So all I'm really trying to do is give plenty of things that I feel like are generally ignored that really lower the probability that we're in that simulation. Because you have to add all these addendums and yeah buts to make it happen. So then I had an additional proposition, which was that it's not actually possible to create an ancestral simulation. or at a minimum, it's an addendum to Proposition 1. And then I had my two separate, propositions, the one about memory and the one about the speed limit. And all that was to do was to simply state that I think that there are certain simulation scenarios that a lot of people talk about that just don't make sense. They logically cannot work.
John?
Sure. And I think for that last point, I mean, it's kind of like a problem that we're going to have for pretty much everything. Like, people are just going to come up with crazy ideas that probably don't work. And I don't know, it seems like, sure, we can dismiss those that are like kind of completely insane or wouldn't really work, but that doesn't make the ones that do make sense, that are supported by evidence, that doesn't make them suddenly no longer reasonable. All right, I think I have a couple of your points for in order to steel man your argument. So one of them is that the argument itself is based off of probabilities, and so if whatever evidence we might present that is supposed to raise or lower our probabilities for that, because of the nature of the question, like being inside of a simulation, we can't, like, if the simulation hypothesis is true, we can't trust anything from our experiential evidence to raise or lower our the possibilities of things outside of our universe. Is it something kind of like that? Because you had mentioned that, like, Elon Musk bringing up how going from Pong to GTA 5 is a non sequitur to the Bostrom argument.
And certainly the Neil deGrasse Tyson one that he brings up in a bunch of different interviews, where it's like, you have a bunch of sub simulations and you throw a dart, which one are you going to hit? That one is, to me, they're trying to solve different, or they're going at different problems essentially.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Sure.
Alan, are you saying that the sub simulation problem makes the likelihood lowers the probability? Because I'm under the impression that that's what raises the probability of us living in a simulation.
No, I'm saying that the sub simulation is a problem that can't be reconciled. So I think that, because Bostrom actually, he talks about either you could have a nesting doll situation, or you could have a simulation where you're just running the same simulation millions and millions of times. I don't think the nesting doll thing is legitimate for the reasons that I mentioned in my argument. You have to run them at 1x speed so that the computers inside of the simulation are functioning at the correct speed,
mm-hmm.
or you, like the memory issue that I talked about for the nesting doll thing. There are some ways around it, but the ways around it assume that you are cutting corners in what John was saying, where, like, you only perceive something as you're looking at it, right? But you can only do that so much, and each simulation that does that is going to have to essentially cut off more and more. Eventually, you're not going to have conscious beings. So I don't buy that the nesting doll simulation thing. I don't think that can happen. I don't think that's legitimate.
It's funny. I actually want to discuss the nesting doll situation with you, because it's funny. You had said that if in our universe we were able to create a simulation, this would actually weaken the probability that we're inside of a simulation for you. And it's funny because almost the inverse is the same for me, where, like,
I think it is for most. Yeah.
Well, no. Like, if it was impossible for us within our reality to be able to create a simulation, I think that might actually be a little bit, or actually, to be more specific, if it is absolutely impossible for us to simulate consciousness being living inside of a simulation, this at least gives me this could in fact raise the probability that we are inside of a simulation, because, like, we already have consciousness. We know that for sure. Now, if
do we?
I do, at least. I don't know. You might be an NPC.
Just to touch on the point here for the audience, you're saying that if we could not actually create a simulation, that would be more evidence for a simulation, because we're running into the nesting doll problem.
I think it's a solution to the nesting doll problem for the simulation creators. So
Yes,
if they program into our physics that they're not going to be able to create simulations with people inside of them, or conscious creatures inside of them, like that's kind of something outside of their capabilities that I'm going to write into the code, then that makes it easier for them to run multiple simulations. But it also protects them from having like this kind of nesting doll scenario, which like fries their computers or something like that.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we agree on that. Now I wanted to kind of get a better understanding so you admit that the actual simulation argument from Nick Bostrom is like mathematical. It's a probability case, but yet it seems like you're not accepting that anything can affect those probabilities at all.
I'm not sure what made you come to that conclusion.
Well, you said that the movement from Pong all the way to GTA 5, it gives us no reason to
No. That's only because that argument is made in a, hey, we're fooling people into thinking that they're, you know what I mean? That is the Matrix, right? That's the Matrix simulation where you wake up and it's your body is in this pod and you've got a thing in the back of your head and they've wiped your memory, right? And they've implanted a new memory and you're fooled into thinking that you're in reality. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about ancestral simulations where we don't have consciousness to work with. We are creating it, right? That's what I'm saying Bostrom's really proposing. And he kind of hedges it and says you could have either, but I mean, my question then, if you're dealing with existing consciousness, then you have to come up with a motive for, like, you know, the robots took over the world and they need us for batteries, right? That was why are we erasing our memories so that we don't know we're in this simulation all the time? You know, because you'd have to run that simulation millions and millions of times to make that probability work. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. I'll have to find out when the questions come in. Al, you're crazy. Crazy enough.
No, I mean it raises, I guess, a point that, like, if we're using already existing consciousnesses, why are we putting them through this simulation process? Like, what end are we trying to achieve with that? Now, there's a couple different ways in which you can argue for it. Any way you kind of argue for it, it's all kind of just going to be up to our guessing. So that's why I kind of tried to steer away from Nick Bostrom's argument, is because it's so theoretical and like, how are we supposed to know? Like, I like having evidence for things. I like to know that there's actually some sort of basis for believing this or not believing in this. So
yeah, to me, it's like I find it interesting when a guy like Elon Musk is so sure that we're in a simulation, and all I can sit there and think is, this guy's freaking Elon Musk. If I was Elon Musk, I would definitely think we're in a simulation too. like no, but I'm me, and if this is a simulation, I want my money back, right? So I don't know. Almost nobody gets to be him or Gates or Brad Pitts or whoever it is that you idolize. Almost no one gets to be that person.
All right, so if I'm understanding your, like, objection to Nick Bostrom's argument, you're mainly saying that proposition 1 is, like, true of the three of his trilemma. Proposition 1, in which all civilizations go extinct prior to being capable of creating simulations. Is that correct?
No, you're close. So I think that absolutely could be proven by the Fermi paradox. It's possible. But more accurately, that I would add the addendum, or it's impossible to actually create a simulation.
That would fit within the proposition 1. Either it's impossible or they go extinct before they can make it possible.
Then that is the argument essentially I'm trying to make.
All right, so you think
I do offer reasons for number 2, right? Which is, once you understand the universe well enough to really, really write a good simulation, would you need to simulate anything anymore? I'm not convinced that you do. Like, if you can write a really, really good simulation that simulates everything, now you have the answers to the universe. Why would you need to simulate it?
Well, that's not exactly how, like, if I'm running a simulation, I'm running random events, like, because that's the thing, for complex systems, you have to like throw in noise in order to kind of like get an actual understanding of like what actually works even amongst all this different noise. That if you just have this like straightforward almost Laplacian demon idea of like understanding of the entirety of reality, it still wouldn't give you good. It still wouldn't give you any good evidence, or not good evidence. It wouldn't give you any good understandings for complex systems that we can't predict. But if we run simulations which like all these unpredictable things happen within them, then it at least gives us what are the kind of variables that stick out and that are actually prominent and are successful amongst even all these differing simulations. Let's see. Okay, so you object to our capacity to create consciousness. Now, you recognize though that Bostrom lays out the other element to that, the point where like we don't need to actually create consciousness. We could just be using already conscious beings, like in the Matrix, something like that. Do you think that it is impossible for already conscious beings to like jack themselves into a simulation?
So I'm not suggesting, first of all, that creating consciousness is impossible. I do think that from the Peter Boghossian, what evidence would help, I think that would go a long way. If we can create consciousness and by modeling 100% a brain, I mean, I think that goes a long way towards the simulation hypothesis. Until then, I'm a lot more skeptical. But I don't have a problem with us jacking our brain into a simulation. I question a motive, because to do that, you would have to be fooled into, like, you don't remember anything. You have to be fooled into thinking that this is the only reality, because that's what we think right now, mostly, right? So why is it some kind of punishment? Like, it just, then you have to think about, you have to ascribe motive for that sort of a thing. And I think that's, I don't know, that just,
yeah, we want to get into that in the questions. We got about 15 minutes left. You guys want to go over to questions? You guys want to do we'll do some questions and then do a closing argument before we close up?
I'm absolutely fine with that. Yeah.
Sure, that sounds great. Give me 1 second. I do actually have a couple of responses to.
Okay, go
motive.
ahead. Go ahead, John. We lost your audio.
You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay, so Nick Bostrom lays out at least the one reason, the motivation behind it, in that like in order to create ancestor simulations. Now, of course, like from our perspective, that doesn't make much sense, but there is the possibility, like you know how you play The Sims, something like that. If you wanted to know what life was like back in 2019, then you could just boot up a simulation and get an idea from that, from your own like godlike perspective, and being able to like mess around with things. Like that's an actual motive that we have in our current life. Of course, we're not using consciously, that we know of, characters in The Sims, but we like still play these simulations just to know what happens. Also, like weather simulations, that would be something a strong like reasoning for why we would want to run simulations. Now, of course, like
need consciousness,
right,
for weather simulations, and for ancestral, you wouldn't be jacking. It would be created. I think you wouldn't be jacking someone into that sort of a simulation, likely. But
right, okay, so yeah, you want to know like what would be the
and then there's the ethical concern, right? So, is it really ethical to create this consciousness? Like, seriously, if you're creating billions of conscious agents, is that ethical?
I'm sorry.
I'm not sure.
I'm sorry to laugh, but I'm thinking we have no idea what the motivations of the people who made the simulation we're living in are. So who knows if they even have ethics?
Yeah, true.
So,
yeah.
So I'm sorry to laugh. I know I have a bad habit of doing that.
No, okay. So you want to know like what would be certain motivations that we'd have to create simulations with conscious creatures or jack people into simulations. Now,
And one sec. So, by the way, guys, I can go a little long if it takes that to get through.
Yeah, same.
I can't. So
okay.
Okay. All right.
We'll try to go through these quick then.
Yeah, go through them quick, and I won't rebut, and then we'll do questions.
All right. So in the first episode of the television show on Amazon, what is it called? It's a rendition of no. It's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Oh,
but
yeah,
it's
yeah.
the I think that's the title. It's the one based off of Philip K. Dick's short stories. Anyway, the very first
Blade
episode.
Runner.
Sorry to spoil it. Yes, yeah, exactly. The very first episode has to do with. In fact, I won't spoil it. It has to do with like why we would create consumer use simulations in which we're jacking in and we're also experiencing suffering within them. One of the
know it though.
No, in fact, that's a main plot point to that episode. It's a really good show. I'll figure out the exact title to the show.
Yeah, give me that. Send me that on Twitter, please. I'd like to check that out.
Sure. All right. The other like reasoning for why we might create simulations and jack actual conscious beings into them without their knowledge is the basis of like, well, freedom. Okay, so technology is giving us much greater capacity to do ill or to do good. So like right now we have the capacity to 3D print a handgun, like completely legally and use it. Now in the future, there's going to be the capacity to like 3D print biological viruses that can like exterminate the entire human race. This would be something that we would not want to just be out there in the public, somewhere on the dark web where you can just download the code for this viral strain of disease and then go to a populated area and just smash it, and like it just spreads everywhere. That's something that like it's an actual concern that we could have for our future. Now, in order to allow people to live within such a society with such high technological capacity and to trust them that they wouldn't use this technological capacity for ill gains or any malintent, anything like that, we would want to know that they have a strong enough fortitude of character to not use this technology with in a way that would be damaging to society. So like if we, upon birth, put our children into these simulations in which we can run them through a life, maybe multiple different lives, giving them multiple different situations and circumstances for them as people, and giving them like certain lives where they have greater power, and with that greater power we want to see if they're going to use it selfishly or responsibly, or we're going to put them into lives where they have very little power, and are they going to use that what they have been given and as resentment towards other people. So the only reason, like if we're in like this post-civilization Star Trek future where everyone has like their own materializer or whatever the 3D printer type thing is in their own home, we would want to make sure that the only people that had access to that were those of good character. And so that would at least be one reason in which we would put actual conscious beings through these types of simulations where they do experience suffering and unfairness and harm and things like that.
Sounds horrible. Adam, I think I want to work on a script with you where the baby is so devious that he fools everybody with these simulations into thinking that he's good, only he's really evil, and he ends up killing the world at the end by unleashing the virus.
Let's go to questions. I have a crack hack for $1.99 says, why introduce so many different forms of suffering? I think you've gone through one of them, which is an interesting argument. You're basically saying that the suffering it's ironic that it's such a religious argument, because it's basically saying only the people who can get into heaven get to experience base level reality. So
yes, exactly. That's the only people we could trust. Yeah. Really.
So it's an interesting argument. Do you guys want to contribute any more? Why is there so much suffering in this simulation, Alan?
So that's interesting. One of the things that Elon Musk said when he was on Rogan, he talked about how base reality, like this must be more interesting than whatever base reality is, because you wouldn't want to, like, why would you create base reality? So maybe they want to put in the suffering. I mean, I don't know. I think that's a nuts thing to say, because first of all, while there is a lot of suffering, I do think it's quite boring unless you're Elon Musk, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
My compliments, Alan. That is a great argument. Like, it's so safe outside the simulation. It's just boring.
Yeah, that is kind of like in a like world with post scarcity, like where you get everything that you want upon your own whim. It might be most interesting to enter into like worlds where you don't have this type of access to everything.
Yeah, stakes. Honest to goodness, stakes. That's interesting. So I have a question here. Is there any evidence the sub simulations are impossible? That's part of Alan's argument. And it seems like we could create these sub simulations where we would create a video game inside of a video game.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of have that already. Like within Minecraft, you have all these people like Seth Bling or people where they're actually creating like these different games inside of Minecraft using the computers of Minecraft, which are like command blocks, which is just like running off code. And so you can actually at least have these nested layer of games, which I mean, if it's impossible to simulate consciousness, which I mean, if we people are just the basis of neurons firing and things like that, then I mean, we could just recreate these neurons firing, and we would assume at least that it would have that same consciousness within it, even if we're doing it on like carbon fiber or something like that, rather than biological tissue.
So my counter is I think you can do sub simulations to a very small degree, because the only way that you can simulate base reality is by making assumptions and cutting corners. Like I mentioned in my argument, you don't need to know what's inside the table until you're breaking apart the table or you're looking at the atoms inside of the table. But you can only do that so much in order to not blow out the memory of the but underneath computer, you'd have to make more sacrifices. You'd have to essentially, reality would be lower and lower fidelity until a point where I don't think you have consciousness. I don't think you can, even if we can create consciousness, if we lower the fidelity of reality, I'm absolutely not convinced that we can create consciousness in that case.
So Drew Welty says, if we live in a simulation, then why don't we have laser eyes? Checkmate, ladies and gentlemen. And I totally agree. I want laser eyes in my simulation. So can you, just to make this in my corner, just to make this clean, can you restate the three premises in Bostrom's argument for us? One of you? I'm not.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay, go ahead.
So premise one is that the fraction of human level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that is one that is capable of running high fidelity ancestor simulations, is very close to zero.
Okay.
So basically we go extinct before we can do it, or it's impossible. That's what I've added. Two is the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running a simulation of their evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to zero. So two is basically they don't want to, or there's some moral issue with it, or they're not interested in it. And then the third one is you're living in a simulation, basically. So those are three hypotheses.
So both 1 and 2 have to be close to zero, or the probability that we are living in a simulation, shoots through the roof, basically, because we can do these things, and it seems like we're interested in doing these things. I don't know that we're
well
not.
Now we are.
Yeah.
Would we be in the future? We don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. So
I think we would be more interested in doing this in the future.
I'm not convinced. We don't know anything about what post-humans will be like.
So do you want to? So John went first to begin with. So if you want to make a final statement, John, this is the time to do it, and then we'll give Alan the last word.
Sure. Thanks. Okay. So, yes, if it is possible that we can create simulated worlds in which there are conscious beings within them that are convinced by the world. And if we have, I'm using we in the collective sense of all life that is capable of this. And if we had the motivation to do so, we would do so, and we would likely create many multiple copies or types of these types of simulations. So just based off of odds, we would be one of those inside the many simulations. Now, of course, this is theoretical, and so like we actually have to, I think, present evidence for why we are or are not actually in one of these simulations. And so I have the three pieces of evidence that are based off of like what predictions we might assume given the simulation hypothesis, where objects do not have their particular properties intrinsic to them until we are actually interacting and observing them. The pathways and histories to particles such as photons are unnecessary to load unless we actually have the capacity to know what the pathway was and actually measure it. And also that all of what we observe and perceive as three-dimensional reality is actually just two-dimensional information that is being kind of interacted with that makes us seem like it's three-dimensional.
And just to give a plug to Don Hoffman's new book, The Case Against Reality, he covers every single one of those pieces of evidence that you laid out. So I'm super familiar.
But he's ultimately against it. He's ultimately against it.
Well, right. Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead. So Alan is saying that Donald Hoffman, who wrote about The Case Against Reality and cited this evidence, is in fact against the simulation theory. He thinks that we're living at base level reality. Respond, John.
Well, he thinks that base level reality is idealism. So the first level of reality is just these conscious beings, like a rock is conscious, and when it interacts with another conscious being, it expresses itself as a rock to that person.
Right.
So his understanding is like base level reality is entirely mental. And his reasoning for that is just based upon the fact that it's seemingly like a over presumption of what we know from our reality onto whatever the meta layer reality is. So he made the case that any creature that goes through an evolutionary process will not observe reality as it actually is, but will rather instead
we lose fidelity. The same argument that Alan is making.
Yeah, they'll only be evolved to see fitness. Now he's making that same assumption for our meta layer reality, which, I mean, if it's a reality in which creatures never go through an evolutionary stage, they're just like already, I don't know, super aliens that know like everything and they can just float around and do whatever, then his argument kind of fails for why they wouldn't be the overworld reality, the original reality.
Right.
So I think that's my like case against his argument is he's over presuming the physics and limitations to our universe that we find within for our constraints and assuming it onto whatever the constraints are for the higher level.
Yeah, like this month he had like a 3-minute video about his comparing and contrasting, and he absolutely takes issue with consciousness being able to be created.
Okay, interesting. We'll have to look into that. So Alan, do you want to give your final statement before we come to a close here?
You know, to me, I feel like I've had a great time. It's been fun. Thank you guys. What I'm more interested in is Adam. I'm going to give you a link. So my statement, as well as a rough draft of the statement, which is like twice as long and it had to be cut for length, as well as some thoughts. I have it in a Google Doc. I'll give you a link to put in the description for the
I'm
video.
happy to do it.
And then, so I just rather engage with people and just have them read it. And I'll have it so that if you have the link, you can add a comment. Hopefully people aren't too mean. We'll see.
So do you want to throw anything out for people in the comments that maybe you can respond to in the comment section?
No, I think just go to the Google Doc I'll give out and like I'll watch the comment section. So
okay, well, thank both of you.
Yep.
This has been great. It's been totally fascinating. This idea terrifies me. This idea keeps me up at night, mostly because religion is so nice because we assume we have a benevolent God. And this idea, we have no idea the motivations of the people who created this world that we're living in. So it's it's a little bit terrifying. So it's interesting to dive into the topic, and you guys really did it justice in your arguments. So we'll go ahead and leave it there. As always, leave your thoughts in the comments below. It sounds like these guys are going to be reading the comments and maybe responding too. So I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for the super chat, and we will see you in the next video.